Welcome. The Bagels Bible Study and Brotherhood is starting a new venture into Kings and Chronicles. We're going to do kind of a harmony of these two books. I've always wanted to look closely at the Kings, and I'm going to start with this wonderful Wizard of Id cartoon by Parker and Hart. I think it's just wonderful. And some questions to consider. Uh, I heard someone say, we have to renew our driver's license every 5 years, but why not our marriage license? And why is it that the same wife who criticizes us when we go out for what we're wearing will also ask us how she looks when she's going out? And then for a ruler or a king, is it better to do well or to do good? Well, that's the question that's going to face people today. So I'll begin with Solomon. And this is a pivotal turn in the empire, in the kingdom. It was the beginning of the end. The kingdom was divided subsequently into 10 northern tribes and 2 southern tribes. The northern kingdom fell after the second Syrian invasion under Shalmaneser and Sargon in 722. And then later, the southern kingdom fell to the Babylonians in 586 BC, and the temple was destroyed. When the people went to the Babylonian Empire, this was the diaspora, and it lasted 70 years. And really, subsequently, people were spread all over the world. There's no place you can go, essentially, in the world where you won't find Jews. Well, in 537 BC, under Zerubbabel, they returned with, quote, all Israel, end quote, to rebuild the temple. And finally, in 458, Ezra and Nehemiah returned with Judah, and Benjamin, and Levi, and other tribes. And all Israel was represented, including Ephraim and Manasseh, and they rebuilt the walls and reestablished the kingdom. So we're going to begin with the end of the beginning. And in the beginning, there were united 12 tribes of Israel. We had Saul and David. Saul as a king, and then David. Saul was a Benjaminite, and David was from Judah. They weren't related. In that time, though, sons often became kings. Jonathan was the son of Saul. He was a good friend of David. Um, it didn't work out for Jonathan so well. Many of the sons of Saul were killed, but Mephibosheth, who was the son of Jonathan, was promised a seat at the table of David. He protected him, but the other descendants were turned over to the Gibeonites for atonement or revenge. Saul had persecuted the Gibeonites, and they wanted revenge, and they hanged Saul's sons in 2 Samuel 1-9. And then David took the bones of Saul and Jonathan and those who were hanged and buried them in the tomb of Kish, which was Saul's father. Absalom tried to take away the throne from David. Absalom was the son of David, and as he chased David out of Jerusalem, he slept with the concubines on the roof so everyone could see it. It was a very insulting thing to do and was testing David's power. As David fled, he was taunted by Shimei. David told Joab to ignore Shimei. Basically, what he was saying was true, and he deserved the abuse. Absalom later was killed by David's captain of the army, Joab. He had caught his hair in a tree and was hanging there. Joab couldn't find anybody to kill him, so he took 3 spears against what David had told him. He killed David's son, Absalom. Now in 1 Kings 1:5, Adonijah exalted himself as king, saying, I will be king. Well, Nathan the prophet told Bathsheba, and they went to the king and reminded David that he had designated Solomon to follow him. And David then, although he was getting old and he was infirm, And of course, that's why Adonijah took advantage of him. He directed Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet to anoint Solomon as king over Israel. And that was around 971 BC. Adonijah feared Solomon, and so he took hold of the horns of the altar. So in 1 Kings 1:52, it says, and Solomon said, if he, that's Adonijah, will show himself a worthy man, not one of the hairs on one of his hairs shall fall to the earth, but if wickedness is found in him, he shall die. Now later Adonijah asked to marry Abishag, the Shumanite. She was a concubine who kept David warm in his old age. She would get in bed with him. I don't think it was really sexual. It was just keeps him warm. Well, to marry her would be a direct threat to Solomon's kingship, so he had Adonijah killed. David was near death, and he called Solomon to his side, and he said in 1 Kings 2:4, if your sons pay close attention to their way, to walk before me in faithfulness with all their heart and with all their soul, you shall not lack a man on the throne of David. Well, then David told Solomon to take revenge on Joab and Shimei, the one who'd cursed David. Well, we've long attached some significance to deathbed pronouncements. When John Adams died, it was the same day that Thomas Jefferson died, but they didn't have cell phones back then. On July 4th, 1826, he didn't know that his nemesis had died, and so Adams said, Thomas Jefferson still survives. They actually become somewhat friends, but with correspondence in their later years, but had gone through a long period of antagonism. Voltaire was asked when he died to forswear Satan. And Voltaire responded, this is no time to make new enemies. Thomas à Becket, who was a Archbishop of Canterbury, was ordered to be murdered by the king. And he was in the church holding on to the altar when he was killed. And he said, I am ready to die for my Lord, that in my blood the church may obtain liberty and peace. Well, what might your last words be? Praise of God? Repetition of some promises of God? Directions to your son to take revenge? Revenge that you didn't have the courage to take yourself when you were stronger? Well, Solomon becomes king, and he dedicates the temple, and God visits him. Solomon says he's not wise enough to rule the people, and God, because of his that he asked for wisdom to rule, God gave him greater wisdom than anyone ever had, and gave him promises that he would have wealth beyond all other people, and that he would have a long life. Well, as you know, he became the wisest man who ever lived. He wrote Proverbs. He wrote Ecclesiastes. That's one of my favorite books. He split the baby. He built the temple. Now, it took 13 years to complete in 1 Kings 7:1. Remember that God did not allow David to build the temple because David had blood on his hands. David had stored the money and the material necessary to build the temple. Now Solomon had some 3,750 tons of gold to do the job. And then he built a palace for himself. And once again, he employed the help of Hiram of Lebanon to supply the wood. Now, here's something very peculiar. He borrowed 4.5 tons of gold for his project. He then gave Hiram 20 cities on the border of Israel with Lebanon, present-day Lebanon, as collateral, and he didn't have the right to do that. This land was given to the tribes by God, and he had no right to give away God's land. But Hiram rejected the cities as good for nothing, and eventually Solomon repaid the loan. Well, the palace was remarkable. It's twice as large as the temple. and a smaller porch that led into a waiting area with very large pillars. There were some 60 cedar pillars in the waiting area, like 15 pillars in 4 rows. I like this representation. It's hard to find many paintings or pictures of what it was like. But notice the lions that are going up the stairs. There were these large lions with very large lions at the top and an ivory chair covered with gold. There were 300 large shields on the pillar and 200 smaller shields, all covered with gold. The larger ones were covered with something like 7.5 pounds of gold, and the smaller with 3.5 pounds each. So there was a total of 2,525 pounds of gold used just for these shields. And then from there, you went into the throne room or the Hall of Justice, and this is where the throne was. It had 6 steps and a round top with armrests and 2 lions on each side. In Second Chronicles, in 9:19, it says, "Nothing like it was ever made for any kingdom." Well, one wonders what influence Solomon's ties with Egypt had on his taste. Here we go. Solomon had a covenant with God. Solomon finished the house of the Lord in the king's house, and Solomon had planned to do all, had And so all that Solomon had planned to do in the house of the Lord and all his house, he successfully accomplished. Then the Lord appeared to Solomon in the night, said, "I've heard your prayers, and have chosen this place for myself as a house of sacrifice. When I shut up the heavens so that there is no rain, or command the locusts to devour the land, or send the pestilence among the people, if my people who are called by my name humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sins and heal their land." That's a phrase that's often quoted and applied to the United States. It really comes out of when the temple was dedicated and the people were dedicated to the temple as a house of sacrifice. Now, they sacrifice animals. They were supposed to sacrifice themselves for God. But notice in this too that there's another if. If you will walk before me as David your father walked, according to all that I've commanded you, and keeping my statutes and my rules, then I will establish your throne as I covenanted with David your father, saying, "You shall not lack a man to rule Israel." And earlier, God had told David that one would sit on his throne and it would be an everlasting throne. Of course, that is the Messiah, Jesus. There's a but, though. There's a ambassador who told his translator, "Don't bother interpreting things that you hear until you hear the word but, because that's the important stuff that follows." And here it says, "But if you turn aside and forsake my statutes," notice the then I will pluck you up from my land and that I've given you in this house that I've consecrated for my name, and I will cast out of my sight, and I will make it a proverb and a byword among all peoples. And look down here, it says, "Then they will say, because they abandoned the Lord, the God of their fathers, who brought them out of the land of Egypt, and laid hold of other gods and worshipped them and served them. Therefore, he has brought all this disaster on them." So how did Solomon usher in the fall of the kingdom? Was it because his sons did not walk before the Lord in faithfulness with all their hearts and souls? Was it because Solomon did not take this walk? Well, let's look and see. The end of the beginning follows the story of 1 Kings in 10, where the Queen of Sheba has visited. Sheba was the area around present-day Yemen, and she visited to bask in the glory of his wisdom. And she was shown without restriction the glory of his palace. It kind of reminds me of later when Hezekiah showed the kingdom's wealth to the messengers from Babylon, and he was criticized for doing this by Isaiah in 2 Kings. Well, Solomon really held nothing back. He gloated over the opulence and the wisdom. and it took her breath away, is what the scripture says. And in the next breath, the scripture describes the gilded shields and the throne and drinking vessels of gold. And it says silver was not considered anything in the days of Solomon. But the wealth was not so much the end of the beginning. The end of the beginning was in 1 Kings 10:23. Thus the kingdom excelled in all things of the earth in riches and in wisdom, and the whole earth sought the presence of Solomon in his wisdom, which God had put in his mind. Every one of them brought presents and articles of silver and gold and garments and myrrh and spices and horses and mules, so much that year by year. And Solomon gathered together chariots and horsemen, and he had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen, whom he stationed in the chariot cities with the king in Jerusalem. Well, the problem is that Solomon had too many horses. Now, it doesn't give the exact number of horses, but goodness gracious. Let's look at 2 Chronicles 9:25. It said, and Solomon had 4,000 stalls for horses. I don't mean figuratively. He had too many horses. You don't have 1,400 chariots or 12,000 horsemen or 4,000 stalls without an equivalent number of horses. And Solomon had no excuse. Let's look at Deuteronomy 17. There are rules for kings. And it says, when you come into the land that the Lord your God has given you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and then say, I will be king over, I will set a king over me, like all the nations around me. And you indeed set a king over you, whom the Lord your God will choose. One from your brothers shall be set over you. Now here's the first rule. You will not put a foreigner over you who is not your brother. Second rule, only he must not acquire many horses for himself or cause people to return to Egypt to acquire horses. That's the third rule. Now, some people have said there's another reason why Solomon got in trouble. But I submit to you that the order of the rules is first, no foreigner. Second, don't have too many horses. Third, don't go to Egypt. You know, in the Ten Commandments, God put first honoring God, and then later how we interact with others. It seems like the order is important. He must not acquire many horses for himself. Now, I don't know how many is, but it seems like Solomon went beyond whatever number you might have in mind. And there's no indication he's preparing for war. There's no good reason for having so many horses. And it says he should not cause people to go to Egypt to buy or acquire horses. In 1 Kings 10:29, it says a chariot could be imported from Egypt for 600 shekels of silver and a horse for 150. And so through the king's traders, they were exported to all the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Assyria. Solomon was involved in trade with Egypt to acquire horses, and he was selling them beyond. This is a violation of those rules. Solomon was a military man. While he was king, he built up the empire. He built up protection for the temple. He built up protection for other cities, and he kept the peace. But he really wasn't at war, and it's questionable whether they needed all these horses. Well, then the question you have to ask is, how serious was God about these rules? You know, pretty serious. He says, and when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, and further down it says, keeping all the words of this law, um, his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, that he may not turn aside from the commandments, either to the right or to the left, uh, so that he may continue long in his kingdom, he and his children in Israel. In other words, if he doesn't follow the rules, then he'll lose. In 18, it says, he shall write for himself a copy of this law, and it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life. Why? Well, in 20, it says, to fear the Lord his God, that his heart may not be lifted above his brothers. But wait, Solomon was the wisest king, the wisest man who ever lived. Surely he was above hubris. Well, let's slide up to the beginning of 1 Kings 10:3. That was when the Queen of Sheba was visiting. In 1 Kings 10:3, it says there was nothing hidden from the king that he could not explain to her. But he also showed her everything about his wealth. So did the problems begin with the Queen of Sheba, or was it just women in general? We like to blame it on the women. Uh, in 11:1-6, it says, now King Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Amorite, Edomite, Sidonians, and Hittite women from the nations concerning which God had said to the people of Israel, you shall not enter into marriage with them, nor shall they with you, for surely they will turn your heart away from their gods, or turn their heart after their gods. And Solomon clung to these in love. He had 700 wives who were princesses and 300 concubines, and his wives did turn away his heart. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was David. So Solomon had many wives, some 700 wives and 300 concubines. Uh, some translations begin this paragraph with but. In the ESV that I'm using, it says now, but it's a turning point. And it's because of the wise that most people ascribe Solomon's fall from grace. That's where they begin. But I began with the horses. And I think they have a valid point. But remember, polygamy was practiced by most of the biblical patriarchs. David had 15 wives, Abijah had 14, and Rehoboam, Solomon's son, had 18 wives and 60 concubines. Now, that does seem to go against the flavor of God's admonitions of a one man, one wife in Genesis. And the question is that you have to ask is how many is too many? 1,000? 10? Some say one. Can you imagine domestic tranquility under Solomon's circumstances? The marriages started out as political expediency to make peace, and his first wife was Egyptian, a daughter of Pharaoh. He must have gone to Egypt, and he likely took fellow Jews with him. And most of the other wives were from near neighbors. God had forbidden the marriage between Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. And Solomon violated this edict. God had forbidden marrying pagans because the man's heart would be turned away from the Lord. Well, Solomon had 700 wives, 300 concubines. That's 1,000 women in the kitchen. He got carried away. So to mollify some of his wives, he built temples and idols for their worship. Their, their culture was preserved. But this generous intention was fraught with blasphemy and betrayal of the living God. So Solomon himself then turned away from the Lord. In 1 Kings 11:4, it says, when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. Now this was especially egregious for King Solomon. In all of this, I left out a verse in the rules for the kings, and I'm going to go back to it now, the missing verse, and that's verse 18. I skipped it because it says, and he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire excessive silver and gold. So that's rule, what was it, 5 and 6 there? You know, even lawyers, great lawyers like Johnny Cochran and F. Lee Bailey couldn't defend Solomon here. And so what's the judge of the universe to do with Solomon? But wait, I have a problem with starting with his many wives. Solomon liked the opulence that God had promised. He got carried away, though. So mentally compare the palace with the temple. God's house was relatively modest. Why did Solomon need such opulence? What was the first instruction, though, that God had given the rules for kings? Well, the first was no foreigner as a king. And the second one was he must not acquire many horses for himself or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses. And so what was the result? Well, he had gotten too many horses. His first wife was from Egypt. Was dealing with horses that were from Egypt. And so God did what he promised. Um, there are many books with collections of God's promises today. I haven't looked, but I wonder how many of them have collections of God's penalties, promised penalties. So God's anger was with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice and commanded him concerning this thing that he should not go after other gods. But he did not keep what the Lord had commanded. And therefore the Lord said to Solomon, since this has been your practice and you've not kept my covenant, my statutes that I commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom away from you and give it to your servant. Yet, for the sake of David, your father, I will not do it in your days, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son. However, I will not tear away all of the kingdom. I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of David, my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem that I have chosen. And so the Lord raised up against Solomon an adversary, Hadad the Edomite. The word adversary is Satan. The Edomites were descendants of Esau, the elder son of Isaac, and he was born, quote, red all over, end quote. He's a twin brother of Jacob. And Edom was the land of the south of the Dead Sea. Most of Israel's enemies came like waves of the sea. They would appear and then disappear, each tribe being potentially destructive. But Edom was always there, always an adversary throughout their history. Edom became the rabbinic code word for enemy in the ancient writings. Joab killed all the men of Edom. When I say all the men, that's in quotes. And Hadad fled to Egypt as a boy. He took men from Midian and Paran to Egypt, and you can see that they are around the Gulf of Aqaba, south of Edom. And Herod later married the sister-in-law of a pharaoh. Well, when news that David had died, Hadad wanted to return home, and he became a thorn in Solomon's side from the south. Well, the Lord also raised up Rezon, who led a band of rebels in Damascus, and that was to the north. And he ruled in Aram, and he was an adversary as long as Solomon lived. In fact, for the next 2 centuries, the Aramean kingdom of Damascus became Israel's most formidable enemy. Well, in 1 Kings 11, it says Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, rebelled against the king, and he was from Ephraim. You can see Ephraim just above the tribe of Benjamin and above Judah. Benjamin surrounds Jerusalem with Judah to the south. We'll learn more about him next week. Well, what are some of the life lessons that we can glean from this story? I give at least 5 interrelated. I'm sure there are more. But the first is be careful what you wish for. You know, the people wanted a king. They wanted someone to look like a king, someone who was a warrior, who was wise, and they got that. But Solomon instituted forced labor. He had incredible opulence. He fortified the kingdom, but he made enemies for the kingdom. He was unquestionably wise, but he did not walk with God as he should. The second is that God has in several places given instructions on how to live for all of us. And when we don't live according to his will, when we don't repent, then there are consequences. God may forgive, but he also may still punish. And it doesn't matter in the long run how wise or wealthy we are. If he forgives and forgets, we call that grace. If he forgives and punishes, that's justice. A third lesson, seemingly innocent and unimportant actions have consequences years later. David invaded a third-rate country of Edom, and he created a nagging adversary. And likewise, he drove a bandit into the wilderness who would later become a mighty empire to thwart David's descendants. We just can't foresee the eventual outcome of our actions. We must pray for God's direction and follow what we believe to be his will. Whatever our actions, though, or consequences, are timeless. That's why God delays judgment on all of us until the end of time. For me, it reminded me of Shakespeare and Julius Caesar, we all learned in high school. We were said at the burial of Julius Caesar, Mark Antony said, "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. The evil that men do lives after them. The good is oft interred with their bones." The fourth lesson is God can use anyone to accomplish his will. Pagans, priests, Christians, charlatans. He can use evil as well as the good of others. A fifth lesson is that we should not choose to be a tragedy. And the preacher commentary points out that the word tragedy can be translated to the song of the goat. And it may stem from the Greek drama festivals. They gave an unwanted goat as kind of a consolation prize to a loser. Well, a tragedy is defined as a serious play having an unhappy or disastrous ending brought about by moral weakness. I was touched a couple of days ago when I got a phone call from a Chinese student that had lived with us 5 years ago while he was in high school. He was with us for a couple of years. Uh, his 21st birthday comes up this next week, and we had sent him a gift for that. And I thought at first maybe that was why I was calling, but I didn't think that the gift could have gotten there in time. And indeed, that wasn't. To my surprise, he called to ask for advice. That was very surprising in itself. He's off at the university now, and his question was his girlfriend had suggested that they live together next year. And he wanted to know what we believed. My wife very wisely said, "Well, what do your parents think?" And he said that his mother was against it. His father really didn't have an opinion one way or the other. You have to understand that he's not a believer, and the family claims to be atheist. Well, my response was that social studies have shown that those who live together before marriage have a higher divorce rate and perhaps is a, shall we say, complication that he doesn't need at this stage of his life. And so we both recommended that he not live together, that he explained that they should be separate. I did look up later to make sure that I was quoting this correctly, and that's true, what I said. But apparently, it's an older study. And studies in the 1970s and the 2000s showed that cohabitation made divorce more likely by 33%. But newer research shows that figure is receding, and a new study shows that the rate is about the same. Uh, they also found that a critical factor was age. And the rate of failure with the relationship before age 23 was higher, and after 23 was essentially equal. Well, we're all faced daily with moral choices, and Solomon chose to serve Solomon, not God. And Solomon got the goat. He was a tragedy. The sixth lesson is that everyone is vulnerable for corruption. Solomon was the wisest man who ever lived, but he did dumb things. He was incredibly wealthy, but he did dumb things. He was a competent general, but he did dumb things. He'd been appointed by God, but he did dumb things. He had a different babe each night. He had peace in the land, and he did dumb things. Well, this is the end and where we would have discussion. So I hope God blesses you, and I hope this lesson is useful.